Good morning, everyone. Tim O'Riordan, one of the members of the Council of NCI. I'd like to see if we can draw all the 4 or 5 speakers this morning into one single possible task force for NCI. And let me just very quickly get the angles together. The first presentation we heard was from John, and John, who's behind us, had one of these word diagrams, and in one of the word diagrams was the word barrier, which was very small at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And barrier is actually probably the most important issue we face in NCI, and we should be giving it big coverage rather than just a tiny spot. Then we had a very interesting presentation from Giles, and his final presentation or final chart was about how we are not using our capital accounts in a way which could be reinvested in natural and social capital. We're therefore running our economy down by doing so. That needs highlighting. The third was the suggestion from Simon that there's a bit of money in NERC for certain kinds of task force analyses. And I'd like to see if we can draw Simon into that. The fourth one was the presentation we had from Peter, which actually started raising questions about how we should look again at the Natural Capital Committee if there's an opportunity to reassess it. And maybe there's something we could do in the NCI about that, because there's roughly some period of time anyway before that happens. And finally, we had a fascinating presentation from Richard, which said, what about the chartered accountants in all of this, particularly in relation to a much more socially rich notion of capital rather than one which is more of a mechanical accounting exercise. So my suggestion to NCI is that we might be setting up a task force for looking at what these barriers are. I ran a little meeting here about a month and a half ago, and we discovered that one of the things that really was upsetting flood management and that whole area of natural capital and water resources and integrated catchment was that the point scoring system that is set up by Treasury and by the Environment Agency is actually antithetical to natural capital accounting. And then maybe realise that actually most of the regulatory bodies that we deal with have no structures for accounting or assessing investments which are supportive of natural and social capital accounting. And now we have a situation, we're coming from our chartered accountants friends, that there is a yearning for this possibility, but we need a way of looking at it. So my suggestion is that we set up a task force within NCI, utilising all of the connections that our speakers this morning have, to see whether we can investigate what these barriers are, how we can reassess them, how we can have a look at new ways in which we can account for different forms of integration and assessment into natural capital and large systems of social and ecological change, and bring in some of the things that we heard from Richard at the end about the integration of humans with nature as being an intrinsic part of that assessment, rather than something we simply put to one side because it's too difficult to count. So my suggestion, Alison, is that we actually work on some task force and encourage our friends on the table to say, will you come along with us if we are keen to set this kind of thing up?
Anybody want to pass comment on this? Well, point taken very, very well. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, there's 2 questions there sitting next to each other. Yeah, in the middle there. Yes, thank you.
Yes, many of the speakers emphasized how human activities, especially economic activity, has been degrading what they called variously nature, the environment, natural resources, natural capital, ecosystem services, and so on. There was some ambiguity about how all these terms relate to each other, whether one supports the other or whether they are alternative, even divergent ways of conceptualizing what we're talking about. So that's one kind of question, but it relates more fundamentally to a different point that was raised, that there has been at least an implicit assumption that whatever we call these entities, they exist somehow on their own, and they change only through, say, human activity degrading them. But 1 or 2 speakers hinted at an opposite aspect, namely that, for example, if we call it ecosystem services, that all of these depend on human activity for their maintenance, even protection. And this is hinted by the phrase semi-natural environment, which has guided or underlaid nature conservation initiatives in this country for a long time. As one speaker said, nature no longer exists almost anywhere in the globe, but especially in this country. And likewise, the last speaker emphasized the role of people in the global south, especially indigenous people, in conserving, maintaining the natural resources on which they most immediately depend. So I want to ask a question about all these terms. How do these terms at least imply or assume that whatever they're trying to protect somehow exists all by themselves, all by itself, and perhaps conceal the role of daily human activity in maintaining them? And then that leads to the next question: how does natural capital valuation potentially obscure or undermine those daily activities that maintain natural resources?
Who wants to go first on that one?
I guess I sort of alluded to it in my presentation there. I think it's a very valid point. There's a lot of different terminologies and different ontologies coming about out there, and I think that's been demonstrated clearly today by the presentations that we've had. And there is a big need to actually have an understanding between the disciplines, between the natural sciences, between the economics, between the finance, and between the accountancy, what we're actually referring to. Before, we don't have to define a new set of terminology, but I think we just have to start having, which is the point of this workshop in a sense, is to actually understand the common language. What is the commonality between the four? And that way I think we can start taking a step forward.
Can I just make the point that, I mean, I think it's quite clear that we have almost no pristine environment, if you like, and therefore, you know, human interaction has already changed the natural capital system, if you like, we have. So I don't think there's any doubt at all that we know that there's an input and an output effect. I think the main problem is around defining what the optimum, if you like, productivity in a natural capital sense of systems are. And in some areas, it doesn't always follow that the pristine environment is actually the highest amount of natural capital, but it certainly does follow that all of the existing systems are blind to, from a market or a business or a finance point of view, many of the benefits that they deliver. And as a result, if most of human endeavour seems to be around optimising the systems, if they're only optimising on one or two of maybe the 10 metrics which represent the value that's coming out, it's unlikely that we're going to pick the optimum point.
Can I say, thank you for the question. So I think on the one hand, I probably used different terms interchangeably just to avoid repetition, saying natural capital over and over again. Or those, and on some part it was deliberate, because talking about natural resources, I was thinking in terms of, well, this is a more narrow subset of what we might broadly construe as natural capital, which made sense in my own internal glossary that I have. But I think it implies that actually maybe there needs to be a kind of an external glossary that we contribute to. So I don't think having numerous terms matters as such. It's just as long as we sort of understand how they fit together.
I think that a lot of what I was trying to argue was that the need for us to see ourselves as part of a system, and I think, you know, that quite often language is used to separate ourselves from it, and I think then that leads to certain kinds of actions and thought. Terms such as natural capital, I do believe, are quite value-laden and describe certain power dynamics. But we could just get hung up on defining terms and actually not do anything. And sometimes, you know, the act of definition, you lose everything you're trying to talk about. So I have a certain sympathy with sort of saying, you know, we kind of understand what it is we're talking about, and we should be trying to think more about the process of what we're going to do to make things better.
Okay. You first.
Hello, Steve Anton. Is there any purpose, in your opinions, of trying to measure natural capital absolutely to reach a valuation of nature at any point? Or should we be concerned more with whether it's increasing or decreasing? Or is it the flow of benefits into the economy, in your opinions, that matter most?
Yep. I think the endeavour to find a specific value of all natural things is just a fruitless task. You know, there are some things that lend themselves to being valued. I think there are other things that I agree with the kind of Mike Jones analysis. There are things that critical habitats that should just be put beyond reach and not be valued. There's a piece of research that Futera did for Accounting for Sustainability, where they interviewed finance directors and chief executives, and I may be hopelessly over-interpreting the piece here, but what seemed to come out of it was the accountants, if you like, the assumption was that the accountants needed an economic number to make a decision. And actually the response to that was, no, we don't actually trust that. We don't think it's robust. I think what a lot of business people want is robust data, robust information. And I think that sometimes we trivialize that into they want a single number. I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's two elements there, Richard points out. One is that should you, and well, Richard spoke very eloquently about that, and the other one is could you, and I think that there are some really practical questions as well on the could you side of things, because there are significant challenges thinking about how you value a stock of anything, because essentially you're making a prediction into the future about how much of that stock you're going to have, which is contingent on what state of the world you think you're going to be in, and also if you're thinking about valuation, what value will people place on that, possibly decades into the future. And it's not necessarily that it's impossible for certain components of natural capital, but for others it may well be, and for others we may well be within the realms of speculation where we're uncomfortable.
From my perspective, in a sense, we're in this age, to quote, of big data. And some of the slides I showed this morning, there's a cryosat, which is producing phenomenal quantities of data from satellite imagery, all this sort of baseline data. There's plenty of other satellites up there now and more going up, producing a plethora of data. And going down to the small level, we now have eDNA, we have barcoding, metabarcoding DNA, which we didn't have even just a few years ago. So we now have the opportunity to really bring all this data together at a much finer level of detail than we've ever had before. So we are beginning to get the sort of capability to have a real in-depth value of what is there and therefore value it. So there's a tension between having that massive amount of data and understanding of what's going on in such a great scale, but also not missing the bigger picture and doing that valuation.
Lady down, yep, and then back up to the very back after that.
Thanks very much, Sarah Mukherjee. Thank you for very powerful presentations. I don't think there's anybody in this audience that isn't convinced. And the reason the politicians, we mentioned about the wealth of policy work and the lack of action that's come as a result. The politicians started this because climate change was 1, 2 or 3 in the issues that people worried about most in opinion polls for years and years. Then we had austerity. Now people are on stagnant wages. They're worried about whether they're going to pay the rent next month, or whether they'll have to go to a food bank. How are we going to convince, look outwards, turn outwards, if you like, and convince those people that this stuff, now the weight of evidence is ever more strong, this stuff is still important, and there still needs to be a political drive to get some of those great policies into some sort of action?
Yeah. On that. That's a really good point. I mean, my own view, as I touched on it, is around moving the debate to well-being. And I think, if you want one critical thing, it's actually moving off this complete sort of monopoly of GDP and of economic growth, having this single measure, and actually look at what we really want as a society. And I think we've got to mobilise more of a mass movement about what the economy is for. Aldersgate Group's launched something called An Economy That Works, where we actually try and set out what we think all those criteria are for something that an economy that works, and it begs the question that you can't possibly measure that multidimensional output with this sort of single metric. At a personal level, I also think there's an opportunity from austerity, which is why I hinted at in the fact that if you've actually got flat growth in terms of your incomes, in terms of your job prospects, in terms of your investments and whatnot, you do actually turn into what actually is important in life. And that's actually a time it's quite good to go to the individual and say, do you know what, money isn't everything. There are other things which actually make for a good life. And once you start into that dialogue and you see the importance that nature has in it, maybe we can get more valuation, if you like, at a personal level in terms of personal values as to what they want to see from their environment and from natural capital.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Recently, part of the NEA follow-on, there was a really great piece of work, a public dialogue on the follow-on run by Rob Fish next door. I don't know if he's here today. He is there today. That was really eye-opening for me, I thought, and I thought it really did a great thing. It brought together a whole demographic of people, spatially, economically, and socially, from all across the country. Very, very normal people, your average public. But by the end of it, they'd really got what valuing nature and natural capital meant, and they had some really incredible, incisive comments and views. And it's activities like that, I think, that take it out to the public, which is then going to sort of take it forward to our politicians, to Greg Clark and whoever. And that's a really important direction to take and really powerful.
I think that there's also work to be done looking into how we're focusing on ecosystem services, how these are distributed. I mean, we know that there's been a powerful message gotten across about the way in which, say, the burdens of air pollution are distributed in some of our cities, and that message has certainly been building up over the years, and the way in which increasingly green space is distributed as well, and there's certainly some important work, I think, mainstreaming some of that thinking into this ecosystems services research that we've been doing, which is very much focused on economic sectors or at the aggregate level.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Bill Watts, and I used to be an economist with the Environment Agency, and indeed before that with the Economics and Financial Affairs Directorate in the Commission. One of the things which also came out of the workshop, which Tim referred to earlier, was the importance in terms of the rather unfortunate outcomes that we get from flood risk management is the issue of perverse incentives, which I think in terms of that discussion we could actually identify as being down to the sort of siloization of much of the way that we organise ourselves in society. You know, whether it's actually you're dealing with flood risk management, or you're dealing with water quality, or with biodiversity, or whatever. These are all things which are dealt with quite separately, and that means that basically you don't get an optimal and you don't get a systems view in things. And it strikes me, in terms of the discussion this morning, that we have a further sort of layer of perversity, which is actually the sort of measurement of GDP. And of course, the GDP is really important to government, or measured GDP, because it's actually the thing that they tax. And certainly in the current environment, so that the ability to raise tax revenues is extremely important to government. So it seems to me we've got a whole series of perverse things going on. And I suppose the consequence of that is that is it a surprise that things don't work really well? One possible answer here, of course, is some form of more developed sort of payments for ecosystems approach in terms of the way that we organise things. So there is actually a formal imperative to actually pay for ecosystem services. And I'd just really like to get some sort of sense as to people's view as to the realism of that. I mean, Giles has already mentioned that there are problems in terms of valuation, but I mean, is this insuperable? I mean, is this something that we should be doing?
Happy to kick off
Yeah,
again. I'm glad someone's mentioned tax. That's a really important issue. And yes, of course we can do more. We can't convert tomorrow to a resource-based taxation system, you know, but there's a lot of evidence that our taxation system currently is based on a very backward-looking model, which is around, you know, taxing jobs and productivity, and rather than actually sort of taxing the underlying use of resources, which would have a massive effect on our behaviours. I'm a great believer in the fact that also tax is a very powerful lever, because I think as soon as you talk to an individual or a business and say that they're going to get £1, if you tell them their £1 that they're getting is a tax rebate, that is actually a far more valuable £1 than I think almost any other £1 you can be given. You always feel really good about that. So I think it's a very powerful lever, and I think one of the things that I would like to see is more ambition from government, and that involves engaging with Treasury to look at how we can increase the take of green taxation. And I think we need to do that slowly. It's not going to happen overnight, because there are a lot of pitfalls in it, and I think you just hinted at the key problem, which is the certainty around tax revenues, which is very important for society. And I would just highlight one issue, which is a big issue at the moment. One of the most successful taxes, I think, at actually changing behaviours has been the landfill tax. However, Treasury still sees that as a permanently bankable income stream, whereas its purpose was actually about diverting waste from landfill, and its final success would be to actually collect zero landfill tax because there is zero going to landfill. This is really scary when you tell Treasury that, because they say, oh my God, we can't possibly have part of our taxation system built on something that's designed to end up at zero. We have to change that mentality in order to use environmental taxes successfully, and that's going to be quite a big culture change, but I'd really like us to start on the path tomorrow.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and one of the things that we've done at the Institute is to start a kind of big debate around what is the tax system we want, because what's very clear is we need to rebuild trust in the tax system, and you could have a tax system you trusted but hated. So the second point is, how do you reconnect people with the tax system as citizens, and to see it as a good rather than a grudge purchase? And I think one part of that would be actually if we had a tax strategy. So tax is completely done as on a reactive, knee-jerk basis. We haven't got no tax strategy at all. That might be a start.
Yeah, just quickly. One of the perspectives I tried to put in my presentation was the sort of the more global perspective, and I brought in ESPA, and I think that has a real big role to play here. It's not just about tax incentives. There's a lot of work to be done in this space in developing nations and working with poor nations and poor people who have to go out into their native forests and harvest the wood for the fuel burning, etc. So there's a lot of payment for ecosystem services models or variation of models that are being done there and through that sort of scope, and it's something we should, as a community, a research community, be very much aware of and thinking of.
Yeah, great.
I mean, there was a lot of elements to your question, Bill, but partly it seemed to be avoid unintended consequences as the message, and I think sort of part of that might well be less siloed thinking, but it's also learning by doing as well. So we know a lot about payments for environmental services, ecosystem services. That actually, as the ESPA programme makes clear, a lot of those programmes aren't actually payments for ecosystem services. They're payments for something. But by learning about that, then you can get improvement over time, and as shown by that ESPA-related research, and certainly for the valuation as well. These are issues which can be clarified over time with research. Uncertainties will remain, but we will get better at understanding these issues.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Arjan Ruijs from the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. The presentations were quite interesting this morning, but what struck me is that you quite often use the word business has to or government should. And there's a lot of challenges that we are facing, and we're kind of presenting the solutions that we think should save the world. But we find out that, well, people don't follow what we say that they should do. Are you also looking at the transition process that is needed for these changes to take place? Or I'm only you only say, at least to me, I only hear that these are solutions, and from a supply side we think this should be done. But what do the people from the field say that they need to change their behavior to take into consideration the importance of nature? Are you also looking at those issues and finding solutions and barriers for that?
One of the things that we've been very conscious of in the Natural Capital Coalition in developing the protocol is that we have to engage a large number of businesses in the pilot testing from the start to really engage them in what it is they need, how they work about it, because a lot of people are at the they don't know what they don't know phase. We all are, really. So yeah, that's an example of working with business to develop those protocols around what is the information you would use to help you make decisions. But alongside that, you need a kind of I'd kind of say a complex system approach to policy making. You need to involve governments at the beginning and policymakers at the beginning with businesses to work out how you create the policies that influence the system that achieves the goals you want.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of what Aldersgate's doing is around articulating, from a business perspective, what actually the requirements are and how the level of understanding is. And it is a combination of capacity building in terms of understanding what the issues are and then actually articulating what the asks are. But I make no apology for the fact that it's actually quite polite language at times to put down policy arse on, for example, government, because actually it's a polite way of saying stop doing the things which are really damaging. And we talked about perverse incentives on the previous question. And I think that one of the problems in this area is that we do get in simultaneous behaviour things which are giving a strong indication to meet the kind of facilitating activities that we need, and at the same time giving very strong indications in completely opposite direction. And I think it's that lack of coherence that is the biggest problem at the moment in terms of getting the pull to have an effect.
Thank you. I'm Tony Allen of King's College London, interested in water, but I have a question which is mainly aimed at Giles and Richard. If we'd been having this meeting 200 years ago, we would have been talking about labour. Capitalism arguably got labour wrong spectacularly, and it took 100 years of struggle to get slavery out of the way and the beginnings of some decent labour relations and regulation and pricing. Our generation and our grandchildren's are going to be coping with this one. And I would suggest that the outcome is going to be rather similar, an unsatisfactory but better outcome than it was before, but not a perfect one. So can I just ask, my question is about mainstreaming. That is, mainstreaming these ideas within the profession of economics and mainstreaming these in the world of society and business. So I get the impression that this green economics, or whatever you call it, natural capital accounting, isn't mainstream economics, and it's done in other than economics departments mainly. I just wondered if you, and I'm very proud to even know you and respect all the things you say, but can you give us a perspective on that, and what's the trajectory in terms of getting this up the pecking order in the corridors and temples of high economics? Your ideas, Richard, were so powerful because you not only waved at, but engaged with politics and power and the system, which we're obviously not going to deal totally with today, but really is the basic thing. How do we mainstream your extraordinarily deep insights into this, into the world of business?
Do you want to go first? Or
it's a difficult one. I can give you practical examples of how we're tackling some of it. So we've set up a project within the institute which we've called Audit Futures, which is around getting the audit profession and the wider accounting profession to start to think about these ideas of what it means to be a professional. And we've had some success with that in terms of I think it's about generating the debates and making sure the conversations are happening. It's very difficult to measure this sort of change by kind of specific outputs, you change behaviours. But one concrete example is that we now teach a section at the Manchester University Business School around critical thinking and moral philosophy in terms of what does it mean to be a professional and what's your obligations. As an institute, we've made some quite public statements. So, for instance, a bit over a year ago, there was a lot of issue around, which I think the Times took up, which was around aggressive tax avoidance, where high net worth individuals were using clever accountants to zero their tax bill. We made a very public statement at that time that we did not think our members should be doing that. We did not think it characterised them as professionals, and it was not something they should be doing. As a result of some of this work, we've now been invited to run panel sessions at something that's rather glamorously called the World Congress of Accountants, but it is the Congress of all accountancy bodies. So we're kind of making change in that ways by driving our thinking through engaging with the profession and the membership. We've done it through helping try to set up the Natural Capital Coalition, whose aim is to take to business these ideas around needing to build your dependencies and your impacts on the environment into your business decisions. And rather than create another reporting framework, it's more about a management accounting framework, about how do you generate the information you need to make decisions. So we're kind of doing it there. It feeds into some of these debates feed into our qualification We don't have a specific sustainability paper because we believe that it should be embedded in all of the questions that our people taking our exams should take.
So mainstreaming green economics in economics departments. So I won't go back 200 years, although it is something of a slow burn. But say if we go back 20 years, there would be a very good story to tell about this. But actually, I think in all honesty, a lot of that has changed now, although it's a slow process. So you can see in many economics departments an increased interest in climate economics, in what we might call environmental economics. Actually, I was interested in Peter's comment that some noticed environmental economics around the noughties. Well, there wasn't a lot of activity in the late 1980s, 1990s in the United Kingdom, although I take the point that it does take a while for messages to spread. But say in that period, the 1980s, 1990s, I think environmental economists in the United Kingdom were a particular breed. They perhaps were, they were interested in economics, but they were just as passionately interested in the environment. I think now it's seen more as a terrain where somebody who's interested in a mainstream economics career would choose to locate their research because they find them compelling issues. Hopefully, they're intrinsically motivated by environmental concerns too. But I think there is now a new breed of economists being trained in the environmental field within that what you would consider to be that mainstream mode of thinking.
We've just got time for one more question, I'm afraid, right at the end there. You've been waiting patiently. Sorry to all of you who we haven't got to, but we're right out of time.
My name's Robert Kenwood. I'm representing IUCN Sustainable Use and Management of Ecosystems thematic group. We had a question earlier about payments for ecosystem services. And of course, DEFRA distributes these in the UK to landowners through the Rural Payments Agency as public payments for ecosystem services. But there are a lot of private payments for ecosystem services. The private sector owns most of the land and water within the coastline of the UK. And I just wondered, since this is such an important sector, how many people are here who represent that sector, for instance, through being members of the Country Land and Business Association or the NFU or anglers or even shooting people belonging to Basque. How many of them would be? Any hands? 1, 2, 3? Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of our session